what I want to do this evening is to share with you some work that I've been doing with a colleague, Andrew Leach, at the University of Sydney. We've been looking at new ways of thinking about early colonial architectural histories in our region. And we've been particularly interested in how we begin to construct these histories operating across national, state and former colonial borders, and mindful of the geopolitical, the economic and the social flux during the early colonial period. And the paper that I'm going to present to you this evening enters into that field via a discussion about materiality in early colonial architecture and the ways in which we might see material in architecture as connecting architecture located in quite disparate places. It's also a paper which is very much about how we think about constructing architectural histories, so how we bring work together into those histories. Now, in this paper, I thought I'd just say up front, I will talk about the Tasman colonies, and I'm using that term to talk about a region, as illustrated on the screen, that encompasses the early colonies of eastern and southern Australia, as well as New Zealand. So those colonies that are connected by the Tasman Sea. I may use the term the Tasman world. This is a term that was coined by the historian James Ballack. So I'm very much interested in that broader region. And as you'll note from my introduction, I spent a number of years in Tasmania, and Tasmanian work is a key focus point within this paper, but I will loop back across to this side of Bass Strait during the paper as well to make some of the connections to here. So, materials. Reading the colonial history of Australian architecture through its materials does a number of important things. For one, it belatedly attends to the observation made more than half a century ago by an economic historian, K.M. Dallas, that the development of the Australian colonies' mercantile activity, and not convictivism, was key to the colonial history of the modern nation. The trade of a kind of myth for a kind of documented, representable reality implied in seeing history through material flows has implications for not only how the story of Australian architecture can be told, but also for the way architectural knowledge can be located in a highly contestable historical field. Now, there are excellent examples, or excellent accounts rather, of Australia's colonial era architecture and its role in the formation of the region's architecture cultures. So there are major civic and military works designed by architects of note, major homesteads that have acquired significance as nodes in the historiographical fabric of the first 100 years of British occupation, and the adaptation of building types to the demands of living in the highly varied environments of the Australian continent and its surrounding islands. In this, a pastoralised countryside complements increasingly complex towns and cities, respectively sites of production and sites of trade, thereby feeding a global colonial system that is centred on London. But a rather different image of this history takes shape when the building cultures of the colonies of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, so the first two Australian colonies, are read against the social and economic activity supported not only by the buildings that have come to assume a monumental status, but also by the fabric of ordinary structures and dwellings that have largely failed the test of time. Those latter, minor and sometimes ephemeral buildings have been described by the architectural historian Alex Bremner as a grey architecture, alluding in part to its minor or anonymous character, but also to its infrastructural nature and the way in which it connects spaces and structures essential to the colonial experience, including the architecture through which that experience is habitually tracked in history. So we're talking about all these storehouses and all sorts of minor, often industrial buildings. Read thus, this grey architecture of colonial enterprise has provided a physical and an economic infrastructure for both commercial and architectural endeavour, in which the available materials and technologies and the means for their trade and exchange assume an importance that has, to date, not been at the forefront of those colonies' architectural histories. Treating colonial architectural history of Australia and more broadly the South Pacific through its materials, not as an alternative architectural history, but as a specific frame within it, quickly upsets not only the nationalist edges of much contemporary historiography, but also the idea of the architecture that is involved as a response. Recent research by historians of architecture has begun to better figure this relationship between architectural fabric and industrial activity into the narratives of British colonial formation either side of the Tasman Sea, which informs an expanded geography for colonial building and the formation of towns and camps fed by the income and the activity of resource extraction and an associated maritime mobility. So that sort of maritime mobility in terms of trade of all these resources and materials. Now, this region's early enterprises were predominantly focused on exploiting resources, for example, sealing, whaling, timber getting, and flax harvesting. Each of these industries precedes the advent of wholesale pastoralism through which colonial land frontiers were extended in New South Wales, beyond the limits of location, and of course later here in Victoria. Through such extensions, ports like Hobart, illustrated on the screen, so in Van Diemen's Land, and Eureka in what Cook had charted as the Bay of Islands, became important in a global trade, engaging the edges and the islands of the Pacific Ocean, as well as their inland territories. On one hand, the extraction and the trade of resources from in and around the Tasman Sea provided an economic substrate for urban architecture and allowed, more directly, the construction of the physical building fabric to directly enable this same activity. Felled and milled, timbers taken from a gradually more invasive geography of colonial occupation fed from the early 19th century the construction of new plant and ports and the foundations of penal stations and new towns. As the historian Philippa Mine-Smith has observed, early trade in long since exhausted commodities also led directly to the foundation of colonial institutions, all with corollaries in architecture, both obvious and subtle, that have endured long after their foundations have faded from memory. And interestingly, Philippa Mine-Smith looks at sealing, and she makes a connection between the sealing industry, the formation of early colonial banks, such as the Bank of New South Wales, which is one of the forerunners to Westpac. So you can see this line of connection running through to today. The second wave of British settlements beyond the towns founded in direct correspondence with London, so beyond Sydney and Hobart, for example, almost inevitably follow an industrial logic for the placement and stability of new centres, from which patterns of inland pastoral incursion extended. So towns like Port Macquarie in New South Wales or Launceston in Tasmania may have operated within the penal network, but their stability from urban organisation and management to their durable buildings and infrastructure derived from their participation in maritime trade, through which they quickly came to function as new centres from which to expand Britain's territorial frontier. So, on the other hand, through their mobilisation as commodities, the materials as resources taken from the land and drawn from the sea themselves establish new kinds of economic relationships and transactions of varied kinds between the Tasman colonies, British territories in South and East Asia, and with the Americas. These too both had an architecture that can be read by historians in analogous terms, and resulted in buildings and structures that have either been omitted from the record or not related to known works upon which they can be brought to bear. Now, early research into the industrial substrate that linked colonial ports, for instance, across the 18th and early 19th centuries and across empires, has indicated the potential for an entirely new architectural history of this region and its relationships that is more explicitly grounded in political and economic conditions, and hence a different kind of maritime historical reality. An architectural history thus conceived will also recover and problematise relationships over time and geography that have yet to be figured into the architectural histories of, say, Australia or New Zealand, or for that matter, California or China or Chile or India, but which can be recovered by working with an expanded concept of architecture itself. For this specific task, the most significant of these commodities, occupying the intersection between industry and architectural production, is timber. Although less lucrative than seal skins, whale oil, and wool, and hence with less direct impact on the economic underpinnings of the colony's early architectural and urban development, timber nonetheless offers a particularly direct correlation between architectural production, industrial activity, and trade. Timber was obviously critical to the literal building of the region's British settlements. The provision of shelter or the construction of sheds and factories relied in an immediate way upon trees being felled and milled. While trees had long offered construction materials across the Australian continent, and while those who found their way into places where Britons had never previously set foot borrowed knowledge and techniques from indigenous building traditions, so for example like the use of bark sheeting for cladding, the felling and the removal of trees from where they grew as a material for trade was new. Species of eucalypt, especially stringy bark and blue gum, which both grow throughout southeastern Australia, red cedar, endemic to the northern parts of New South Wales, hue and pine, endemic to Tasmania, and kauri, endemic to New Zealand, as well as a number of other endemic hardwoods and softwoods, were quickly put to use in the construction of new buildings, harbour structures, and boats. Timber's availability and its circulation was also intrinsic to the operation of many other industries, especially the aforementioned maritime industries, the physical infrastructure of which was largely timber-based. And in this, timber is interesting. It can be read against the civic materiality of stone, for example. Sorry, I've just lost. Yeah, and it was and stone was likewise, of course, subject to extraction and trade, but on very different terms. So you might build a warehouse out of timber, and perhaps its details using cedar, but banks would be built, and the external details would be out of sandstone. So particular associations with these materials in building. The removal of trees was, furthermore, part of a process of clearing land to allow the introduction of colonial pastoralism and agriculture, where timber was sometimes retained to build sheds, fencing, etc. It was necessary for the repair of the very vessels that would move it and the commodities they carried across oceans and from port to port within the region itself. That trade, in which timber functioned as a commodity and traded as a material to be deployed as components and buildings in local, regional and international markets, also established relationships which might now be understood as inscribing extraterritorial architectural geographies into which the Tasman colonies can now be placed historically. So, what are the stakes for architectural history? Examining those relationships, both in their broadest terms and in specific cases. What are the implications of following building material for how we frame architectural histories in this or any other region. So let me begin to sketch that out for you. The early harvest of timber in the Tasman world occurred at the fringes of British settlements, and the pursuit of the commodity for trade quickly followed waterways, extending the frontiers of settlement and dispossessing Indigenous inhabitants. Take cedar, an easily worked hardwood resembling mahogany and used for architectural joinery. In New South Wales, the colony established on the east coast in 1788, its harvest extended along the Hunter and Hawkesbury River systems north of Sydney Cove in the 1790s, and by 1798 it was the colony's third largest export commodity. From around the same time and into the early 1800s, trading vessels supplying Sydney made occasional commercial ventures across the Tasman Sea to New Zealand for endemic timber species that were suited to ships' masts. So, for example, caricatia. And also they were seeking flax for sails and rope. These were often procured in negotiation with Maori, who would then establish their own trade and diplomatic routes back to Sydney in the early 19th century. These cargoes of timber were initially destined for markets in Calcutta and later in Canton, Shanghai and the Cape Colony, as well as elsewhere. Sydney merchants were increasingly involved in these operations from the 1810s, particularly in the Northern Bay of Islands region of New Zealand's North Island, where the Church Missionary Society outpost was established in 1814. With the establishment of local bases and the assistance of missionary societies in the region from 1819 in Kerikeri and Piahia, timber extraction proceeded apace. Whatever else this transformation of trees into timber and then its mobilisation allowed, so for example, dwellings, infrastructure and pastoral expansion, this extraction underscored new relationships across and between territories that were, as we will see, manifest in architecture and that formed their own architecture. Now, within the geographic frame of the Australian colonies, the establishment of Van Diemen's Land, colonised by the British in 1803, created a regional marketplace for Sydney timber traders, selling New South Wales blue gum and cedar in Hobart en route to London from the 1810s. The Vandemonian colonial administration subsequently established penal stations in Hobart's Derwent estuary to harvest eucalypt species for construction, and in the late 1810s, south in the Doncaster Channel, generating a dispersed infrastructural architecture comprising sites of extraction that were interlinked by coastal shipping routes, rivers, tracks, and skids. So skids are these timberline channels that were used to convey logs down hillsides to water's edges. The structures associated with these sites comprised pits, barracks, huts, jetties, boats, wharves. There were urban timber yards and shipping yards and, of course, construction sites. At the same time, so the 1810s, attention turned to locating the, at the time, unknown habitats of the island's endemic Huon pine, a riverine species that had first been identified and harvested as driftwood. It was prized for its fine grain and high oil content, which worked as a preservative for the timber and made it a promising commodity ideal for shipbuilding, joinery and furniture. A venture to circumnavigate the island in 1815, sponsored by the Hobart-based merchant Thomas Birch, then found the trees growing on the banks of the Macquarie and Bathurst harbours on Tasmania's remote west and southwest coasts, respectively. Birch was thus rewarded by the colonial government with a 12-month monopoly on its extraction for sale. Now, what we might describe as a capital A architecture soon punctured these dispersed networks of timber supply and consumption that connected tree habitats, settlements and colonies. So the Van Diemen's Land colonial government was among Birch's chief customers, and they deployed the Huon pine in the interiors of their most symbolically and socially significant projects at the time. Additions to Hobart's Government House, these were additions built 1817 to 1819, and the interiors of St David's Church of England, construction commenced in 1817 as well. Now, St David's was the colony's first purpose-designed and built church. Now, as Thomas Birch sold his timber locally, and he also shipped it to locations including Sydney and Calcutta, he then built a 3-storey Gothic house. This was the largest and the most architecturally self-conscious residence in the colony at the time. And so if you look at the top of the screen there, you can see St David's Church on the right, Government House on the left, and Birch's residence is that castellated structure back in behind. So they are grouped at that kind of centre part of the Hobart settlement. Now, the commercial success of Birch's enterprise prompted the colonial government to follow with the establishment of a remote yet intensely industrialised penal colony in Macquarie Harbour, serving the needs of the British penal system while focused as an industry on the extraction of Huon pine as well as shipbuilding, which supplied government and commercial maritime infrastructure. Some of the timber extracted from these habitats was used in the construction of further historical works of Tasmanian architecture in the island's towns and settlements that have already been treated to one degree or another in historical writing. Some of it, though, entered into trade that bound the colony to imperial centres, upheld on commercial terms, and establishing new kinds of relationships maintained as often as not at great distance. The extension of local histories to figure in these more distant works, realised from the same material starting point, has yet to be systematically undertaken. And this is an issue I find very interesting. It's how we look at local architectural histories and connect them into wider histories. The sequential colonisation of southern Australia, so Western Australia 1828-29, South Australia from about 1834 to 1836, and then Port Phillip, invaded by Vandemonian entrepreneurs from the early 1830s, then spurred Vandemonian timber enterprises to manufacture and export architectural products, including pre-cut and prefabricated timber building components and dwellings. These dwellings are typically made of readily available eucalypt species, and they were supplied to all 3 of the new colonies from 1828, and they competed with imported dwellings such as Henry Manning's timber portable colonial cottages manufactured in Britain. Further detail on these Vandemonian structures remains elusive, recorded neither in shipping manifests nor in known archives. Nonetheless, by the late 1830s, Port Phillip colonists could observe that most of the newly settled district was being built of Van Diemen's Land timber, revealing the imprint of what we might now cast as the Tasmanian trade in materials and buildings on the architectural history of Victoria. Despite their likely modesty as buildings, in aggregate they doubtless have an importance independent of the significance of the inventiveness of their design. They form one instance, little recognised in a global trade of prefabricated timber structures, some of which, like Ambrose Helland's adaptation of John Verger's 1832 design for the British resident at the northern New Zealand site of Waitangi, served in place of structures that might, in other circumstances, have been built of stone. It is, though, the geography embodied in the relationship between the site of a tree's maturation and extraction, its transformation into timber, its mobilisation as an object of trade and its utilisation in construction, that we offer here as a new starting point for delineating the territory of a particular kind of architectural history, in this immediate case bound to the colonial timber industry. Now, if we set aside the geopolitical lines by which we ordinarily use to carve up or connect architectural histories of the 19th century, so typically these kind of national or colonial kind of entities and borders, what other figures emerge from following the material and the processes that render it available? As in the case of the Hallenverge Treaty House, as it is now called, at Waitangi, this works in different directions. So as the forests of New Zealand were being removed and shipped elsewhere, thereby establishing New Zealand's role in the British economy, New South Wales hardwoods were being sent eastwards from Sydney to construct the house representing the Crown's authority over errant Britons and their commerce. The historiographical figures thus derived from material mobility overlap, but rarely neatly. This, of course, cannot be overdetermined, since the agency of the timber industry is itself limited, responding to demands made by entirely different industries that have their own chronologies and geographies. For example, by the late 1840s, Australia's early colonial enterprises in timber prefabrication were enmeshed in a global market, supplying locally prefabricated buildings across the Pacific to the North American goldfields. So this occurred about 1849 and 1850. And then shortly thereafter, of course, they supplied the Victorian goldfields from around 1851. Now, the Californian gold rush attracted product from Sydney in New South Wales, Hobart and Launceston in Van Diemen's Land, Adelaide in South Australia, and Auckland in New Zealand's North Island. It also entailed a rapid increase in the production and the shipment of timbered dwellings and occasionally other building types. So, for example, in February 1850, the Hobart architect James A. Thompson, himself a somewhat peripheral figure in local historiography, shifted his attention to California, and he tendered for prefabrication 100 houses to be shipped across the Pacific. Within a fortnight, it was reported that he'd also designed a 2-storey hotel. This was destined for San Francisco for the captain of the American bark Henry Harbeck, which departed from Hobart with a cargo of building materials, presumably for the hotel's construction, the following month. Now, as noted by architectural historians Peter Barrett and Miles Lewis, who have examined this moment in trans-Pacific prefabrication, the availability of timber resources in the Australian colonies, along with reliable shipping, made long-distance trade feasible. In short, the distance from the established centres of North America's Atlantic coast down around the Cape Horn was farther than it was from across the Pacific, enabling the Tasman Sea colonial ports to compete alongside other Pacific Rim ports, including Hong Kong, Canton and Chile. It was, however, a short-lived opportunity, soon curtailed by competition, tariffs and the increased availability of prefabricated iron buildings. At the same time, though, Port Phillip emerged as a new market, closer to the point of origin for the Australian timber and timber products, following the discovery of gold elsewhere in the colony of Victoria. Now, the impacts for Van Diemen's Land, the closest point of supply with established timber harvest and milling infrastructure and available labour, were dramatic. Its timber, shipped as materials, components and buildings, temporarily equalled wool as the colony's highest performing export for a 2-year period in 1853 and 1854. Such exchanges were entirely contingent upon resource activation, gold prompting demand for timber, both extracted in specific locations on a redrawn trade map. So the intra and inter regional shipments of these structures, components and materials describe a highly varied geographic reach for timber as a form of material infrastructure, expanding and contracting in relation to speculative markets created by social, economic and technological circumstance. If these cargoes can themselves be considered an endemic architecture, defined against their materiality alone, are there not also other geographies for Tasmanian architecture, for instance, and other bases for architectural history's geographies capable of flexing in relation to those physical, political and artistic boundaries that have controlled the region's architectural history to this point? So alongside works of architecture realised in timber, those churches, homesteads, stores and so forth that populate the classic histories of Australian architecture, this same material, extracted and milled in the same way, was directed towards the realisation of a grey architectural fabric, largely to enable colonial industries directed at the extraction of other resources from the land or sea, or to pursue introduced industries largely bound to the pastoral project and its relentless inland incursions. In 1825, it was reported that the greater part of a shipment of New South Wales timber had been purchased by contractors in England, and I quote, for Windsor Castle, and is being employed in finishing and decorating that splendid structure. In many respects, this has been the organising relationship for Australia's colonial architectural history. Resources returned to the imperial centre to its benefit, even to the extent that the historiography of this region's early architectural fabric has focused on the development of distinct cultures within the individual Australasian colonies. So we'll often talk about New South Wales colonial architecture, Tasmanian colonial architecture, Victorian colonial architecture, for example. It's been seen as a network of peripheral sites and settings, and always in deference to centres elsewhere. The traffic in timber and the ordinary buildings it was used to construct introduces both an alternate set of flows around and beyond the region and an alternate model for understanding the hierarchies baked into the notion of an organising centre. Now, in 2018, at the biannual conference of the European Architectural History Network in Tallinn in Estonia, and this is where some of this work was initially presented, the English architectural historian Mark Crinson responded to a research track concerned with peripheries, which included a series of papers on the architecture of the early 19th century Tasman world. So again, this is where this work was initially presented, alongside Philippa Mine-Smith's work on sealing, Harriet Edquist on whaling, so two other industries. Mark Crinson questioned the easy dismissal of a strong historiographic model of technical transfer and imperial power relations, in which centres such as London and the industrial cities of the British North exert undue force. But is it merely wishful thinking to assert the significance of what would otherwise figure as the periphery, so places like Van Diemen's Land, for example, in opposition to an idea of historical relationships within which it always sits in deference to an imperial capital or the centre? Mark Crinson advanced two proposals that respond to that question and for understanding the architectural history of the 19th century world. The first of these, he suggested, was to finesse rather than to dismantle centre-periphery dichotomies. And for this, he suggested a model of foveality, drawn from the study of how visual information is processed. And so he explains, Experimental psychology uses a tripartite model for visual attention. The foveal at the centre of attention, the perifoveal at the edge of attention, and the parafoveal that sits between the two. This model of foveality can be used in describing temporal as well as spatial changes of interest. It is not an oppositional nor a hierarchical, but rather a relational schema, as objects are never fixed in place, and it makes clear that sight or attention is what's at stake. Okay, so an object is sitting here and it's always moving between these different kind of centres and peripheries. What changes is our relationship to it, not the thing itself. Crinson's second proposal responded explicitly to the set of papers in which this paper in turn draws, suggesting a methodological idea of cognitive mapping, interlinking sites of architectural and consumption and tying, and I'll quote Crinson here, disparate things into chains that reveal different logics of space, unquote. The routes and tracks across an always being drawn map then speak to the realities of movement and the fragility of strong borders and geopolitical relationships in the face of how people and goods and ideas move around the world. Centre periphery then less gives up than gives way to a more nuanced and fluid set of historical figures, determined by timber in this case, and determining the architecture it is activated to realise. We might speak then of the parafoveal space of maritime trade, with lines and relationships it allows, or of materials that suggest evolving historical geographies and through which artefacts and architecture can be tracked and acquire a kind of material provenance and all that is bound up with it. So I offer you here something of an extension to Crinson's proposal's argument, asserting that attending to timber and its mobility can indeed reveal different logics of space that are both particular to this material or resource and reflective of certain kinds of historical circumstances and events that are all too readily glossed over in a history of architecture focused on highly intentioned works and monuments. I'm proposing here a form of parafoveal attention, I'm proposing here that a form of parafoveal attention, taking in timber, might establish the terms for a type of architectural history foregrounded in the geographic, economic, and material dimensions of historical circumstance, rather than the geopolitical or institutional divisions and the kinds of professional and artistic mobilities they support. It would track spatial and temporal changes in response to factors external to architecture. The material traces that it unearths could describe changing relationships within our region as resources were activated, and beyond the region as they were mobilised. This methodological move inevitably trades arguments about how ideas about buildings and the practice of architecture moved around the British world, for a premise in which the intentions of patrons, architects or builders do not matter, and in which the raw substance of building and the paths it is made to follow in response to supply and demand has a material historical geography all of its own. Now, this falsely assumes, of course, that one can disarticulate architecture from the world of ideas, and that it is possible to write a history of architecture on the basis of material flows alone. But the argument here is that assuming something of a self-consciously blinkered stance offers one important way to move beyond our historiographic habits in the treatment of this region. By elevating timber as a resource and as a material bound to specific conditions of extraction and trade, we can conceive of another kind of architectural history than the narratives to which we now have access, exposing forgotten or subordinate relationships around the world, and a different way of thinking about what makes Australian architecture Australian, or indeed architecture. The geography of this history would be defined by the figures interlinking the sites of production and consumption and lines of trade, rather than constrained by ultimately arbitrary colonial and national borders. Thank you.